Here, read this.
Woof.
So the other day, Frank Cotterel-Boyce wrote in a tweet that to him, Matilda had always felt like hate speech. And this appealed to me for several reasons. Cotterel-Boyce's main problem seems to be that the narrator is animated by nothing but spite, snobbery, and a thirst for revenge. Now, I don't agree with that, and this video will get into why I don't agree with that. But it is true that, like several of Dahl's other novels, the plot proceeds by a series of petty vengeances capped with a larger, conclusive vengeance at the end. And the first reason that this appealed to me was that on my last podcast, I was talking about the seminal revenge drama, The Spanish Tragedy by Thomas Kyd. Now, as I mentioned on that podcast, conventional wisdom has it that without the Spanish Tragedy, there is no Hamlet. But it wasn't until now that I considered the idea that without the Spanish Tragedy, there would be no The Twits, no Matilda. And once I started thinking about what the Spanish Tragedy has in common with Matilda, a few things jumped out to me. First of all, throughout Kyd's play, he implicates his audience. He shows groups of characters watching other characters. Sometimes he shows them watching horrible things happen, to the great satisfaction of Don Andrea or Lorenzo. Satisfaction is the point. Kyd knows that the desire for revenge doesn't just come from a sense of moral outrage, but a sense of aesthetic outrage. A wrong has been committed, and we won't be satisfied until we see it met with a suitable punishment. Likewise, Dahl shows Matilda getting great enjoyment out of her revenge schemes. Gluing her father's hat to his head, for example, is a most satisfactory exercise. And it's not just Matilda who enjoys getting her own back. A fellow pupil at Cruncham Hall called Hortensia puts itching powder in the Trunchbull's underwear and then watches on as it begins to take effect. It was pretty wonderful, she says, to be sitting there watching it all and knowing that I was the only person in the whole school who realised exactly what was going on inside the Trunchbull's pants. But I would stop short of saying that the vengeances perpetrated by Matilda and her colleagues are motivated by spite. They are also a matter of self-preservation. Matilda's parents treat her like dirt, like a scab. Despite her doing nothing wrong, she is accused of ridiculous crimes. Getting revenge stops her from going crazy, she says. It makes life tolerable. And this isn't from some sense of smug self-satisfaction. It makes life tolerable in quite a practical way. Her parrot up the chimney scheme, for example, buys her a week of civility, a week of ceasefire where she is not being terrorised by her parents. At the end of the Spanish Tragedy, we see the ghost of Don Andrea, the ghost who kick-started the whole plot, finally satisfied that in his eyes, justice has been served. At this point, the personification of revenge, who accompanies him on stage, says that he will take them to hell and begin their ceaseless tragedy. So this is only the start of the perpetual revenge that Don Andrea's enemies are going to have inflicted upon them. Now, if Matilda, the novel, was motivated only by spite and revenge, then we would see a similar ending. Trunchbull and Matilda's parents locked in eternal agony, Matilda designing endless tortures for them. But no, as the narrator tells us, her enemies leave town physically unharmed, and Matilda is free to go back to school. As for the charge of snobbery, well, to my mind, the most consistent snobbery in the book seems to be levelled at telly, and by extension, other forms of technology. There's a sort of grumpy old man's technophobia detectable in the book, I would say. The human brain is better than just some lump of metal, a calculator. What's wrong with watching the telly, I ask, says Mr. Wormwood, perhaps slightly threatened by Matilda's preference for a good book. Sneaking off to the library, she reads her way through The Secret Garden, Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, Great Expectations, Nicholas Nickleby, Oliver Twist, Jane Eyre, Pride and Prejudice, Tess of the D'Urbervilles, Gone to Earth, Kim, The Invisible Man, Old Man and the Sea, Sound and the Fury, Grapes of Wrath, Good Companions, Brighton Rock, Animal Farm. And speaking of snobbery, Frank Cotterel-Boyce criticises Matilda's reading choices for being middle brow. I mean, she's 4 years old, Frank. In the replies to his tweet, Frank also makes a common accusation levelled at Dahl that in his universe, fat people are always bad and bad people are always fat. This doesn't hold up across the work of Dahl, and it certainly doesn't hold up even in Matilda. Vying for the worst character in the book is Mr. Wormwood, who is a small, ratty-looking man. His wife isn't much better, Mrs. Wormwood, and she is called plump at one point, so I guess I'll give you that. I won't accept that the Trunchbull is fat. She is enormous, but not fat. She's something else altogether, as the narrator tells us. Gigantic, tank-like. She's a physical phenomenon. She's also muscular and fit, an ex-athlete. She's definitely not a fatty. One character who certainly is fat is, of course, Bruce Bogtrotter, who, far from being a bad character, gets to perform, I would say, the most heroic act in the book, more of which later. So if Matilda is hate speech, I struggle to see who it is being directed at. But another reason the tweet appealed to me is that while I think Frank Cotterel-Boyce is wrong to say that Matilda is hate speech, the book is reminiscent of hate speech, principally through the quite unmistakable echoes of fascism bellowing from the character of the Trunchbull. Miss Trunchbull, or the Trunchbull, as the children of Cruncham Hall call her, the definite article signifying that she is something more than human. The Trunchbull. She's a phenomenon. She's a weather event, a change of scene. Dahl compares her to a tank, and he says she marches like a stormtrooper. We hear she was once a famous athlete. When she punts Amanda Thripp into a nearby field, a student comments, "Shades of the Olympics." All in all, a vision of kind of grotesque fitness, reminiscent of Aryan fanaticism. In a moment strongly refuting Frank Cotterel-Boyce's suggestion that Matilda learns nothing, our Wonder Kid wisely notes that Trunchbull isn't mad, just dangerous. In other words, she is much like the many mediocre bureaucrats who, while entirely sane, committed hideous and absurd acts under the Nazi regime. With them, the Trunchbull shares a kind of breathtaking knack for twisting reality. In Cruncham Hall, there is no why. Matilda can't be a genius, she says. She's a gangster. When a child introduces himself as Eric Ink, the Trunchbull replies, "Don't be an ass, boy. There's no such name." She's also plainly rewritten her origins. When a child suggests that surely she was little once, "I was never small," she replies, meaning I was never weak. "I've been large all my life, and I don't see why others can't be the same way." Without wanting to get too dark or insensitive, because I really do think Roald Dahl was having fun with all this, evoking something very sinister, but in an amusing, light-hearted way. It is impossible not to notice that the Trunchbull's ideal school is a vision of extermination. "My perfect school, Miss Honey, is one that has no children in it at all." And this fleeting vision of Trunchbull as a kind of deranged camp commandant is supported by the behaviour of Cruncham's inmates, the children. They have a kind of world-weary resignation to them. They're pretty stoical and uncomplaining in the face of the Trunchbull's brutality. The character of Hortensia comes off like a kind of pastiche of POW characters, like Steve McQueen's in The Great Escape. When she gets locked up in the chokey for a day, she says, "I was off my rocker when she let me out, babbling like an idiot for a week." When an incandescent Trunchbull has dragged Bruce Bogtrotter in front of all of the other schoolmates and accused him of being a member of the mafia, he replies with a sort of British officer's equanimity, "Steady on, I mean, dash it all, headmistress." What makes the Bogtrotter scene so heroic is that, unlike Matilda, Bruce has no edge. He's almost entirely round. No, he has no special abilities. Bogtrotter's triumph is a Christ-like triumph. He achieves victory over his enemy by accepting his punishment, enthusiastically accepting his punishment, I might add, thereby having his tormentor's cake and eating it. The narrator emphasises the extent to which Bogtrotter has negated the Trunchbull's violence and rendered her impotent when the Trunchbull smashes a huge china platter over Bogtrotter's head, which, given her tank-like physique and, her athletic past, probably could have killed a normal child. But because he's eaten all this cake, Bogtrotter is like a sack of wet cement, and it just bounces off him. The narrator says it's unfortunate that people like the Trunchbull do exist, and that everyone runs into one of them at least once in their life. In fact, they don't exist. There aren't any headmistresses who launch students out of windows, whose chief ambition is to destroy the students that her job depends on, who dreams and shares this dream that the children were bugs, and that she could walk into this classroom with a gigantic spray gun in my hands and start pumping it. In a way, Mr. and Mrs. Wormwood are more unpleasant characters because they aren't that ridiculous. There are parents who for no particular reason, despise one of their children. There are, of course, horrible headmasters and horrible headmistresses. Characters like the Trunchbull only exist in deranged realities, either those invented by fiction or those invented by fanatical regimes. And because she's so removed from reality, it gives us space to enjoy the Trunchbull. The narrator shares how the children in the class that she's terrorizing feel. It was splendid entertainment. It was better than a pantomime, but with one big difference. In this room, there was an enormous human bomb, which was liable to explode and blow someone to bits. One of the problems Frank Cotterel-Boyce has with Matilda is that he says that the narrator is a great argument against the idea that reading makes you a better person. And this I found particularly interesting because I completely agree and consider it a great point in the book's favour. It's not just Matilda who reads in the novel. The narrator gives us other examples of readers. The Trunchbull herself has read Nicholas Nickleby and is predictably a great admirer of that novel's cruel headmaster, Wackford Squeers. A clear example of reading a book and drawing the wrong moral. I like the fact that Matilda is refreshingly against the lazy idea that books are just good, that reading is good for you no matter what you read, and it's all subjective really, isn't it? And I don't understand how Frank thinks books can make you a better person when he also thinks that this book is hate speech. It's a depressing measure of what reduced circumstances literature is in, how lax popular criticism has got, that being just 4 books is all that's expected of you. Not to show any discernment. Comforting ideas like, it's all subjective, encourage the sort of anxious reading by numbers, prioritizing ease and quantity, as if you can shortcut to being well read, like Mr. Wormwood, dialing back the speedometer with his drill. There are good books, and there are bad books, and there are good readers and bad readers, just as some children will do better than others. Miss Honey knows that she's lying when she tells Lavender she'll soon catch up with the prodigious Matilda. A society that thinks any reading is good and there is no objective qualitative difference between books only profits publishers who know they can sell crap and never be held to account, becoming like the proud parents at the start of Matilda who, even when their child is a disgusting little blister, start trumpeting about how great they are. I was very distressed to see in the replies to Frank Cotterel-Boyce the author William Fiennes say that Tim Minchin's song Naughty is a better achievement than the novel by Dahl. Just a terrible, terrible opinion. If you don't know William Fiennes, he is the author of a beautiful book called The Snow Geese, which, if you're into bird books, if you're into nature writing, if you're into good non-fiction, I thoroughly recommend The Snow Geese. It is a terrific book. But that doesn't change the fact that this is a terrible, terrible opinion from William Fiennes here. The song Naughty, featured in the musical version of Matilda, is revolting, schmaltzy crap. Exactly the sort of artificially sweetened piss that would get Roald Dahl's bile duct going like the clappers. It's a song straight from the It's Always Wine O'Clock Somewhere hymn book. It replaces what the novel celebrates, spectacular defiance, with a hymn to mediocre consumption. And can I just say, as someone who used to work in amateur theatre, that song, Naughty, will be the absolute scourge of Trinity Guildhall examinations and after-school drama classes for years to come. When you go and pick up your kid from drama class and you see their teacher like slumped outside, smoking 5 cigarettes and pouring vodka into their eyes, it's because they've had to listen to the song Naughty more than once that day. So do them a favour and throw them into a field. A travesty of a song, which shouldn't change the fact that you should definitely read The Snow Geese by William Fiennes. Great book. To wrap things up then, I should say I'm well aware of what Roald Dahl is on the record as saying, the hateful things he has said in the past. I'm also well aware of theories of Matilda in terms of the Trunchbull being a misogynistic portrait or an anti-lesbian portrait. I actually think the lesbian reading is pretty striking. Perhaps that's another video. I know that making her the Trunchbull as opposed to Miss Trunchbull, counter to what I said about making her a thing, making her a phenomenon, like something out of myth, it also elides her gender and could be read that way. I do think that whole portrait is rooted in a kind of sexism. I don't think it's necessarily Roald Dahl's sexism, but a societal sexism. You only have to ask yourself, why is the Trunchbull headmistress and not headmaster, to see it? Like, the extreme violent portrait of the Trunchbull is funnier because society expects women to be more nurturing and caring of children than men. Is that fair? No. But it's a feeling that's there to subvert, and I think that's what Roald Dahl's doing. And definitely, Roald Dahl's humour is motivated by disgust, physical disgust at bodies, for sure. But to say the narrator is motivated only by spitefulness, disgust, venom, I think can be disproved by the opening lines of the novel. It's a funny thing about mothers and fathers. Even when their own child is the most disgusting little blister you could ever imagine, they still think he or she is wonderful. Well, there is nothing very wrong with all this. It is the way of the world. It is only when the parents begin telling us about the brilliance of their own revolting offspring that we start shouting, "Bring us a basin, we're going to be sick." Mr. and Mrs. Wormwood aren't Matilda's only parents. Roald Dahl is also the father of Matilda, and he goes on in the novel to tell us all about her, how sensitive and brilliant she is. But particularly brilliant, he's keen to point out, emphasising her mind over her morals. Dahl leaves Matilda with her magical powers receding, struggling and striving with classmates she can compete with. It's actually one of the Dahl stories that doesn't have some kind of horrible, sticky end. So in conclusion, no, I don't think his narrator here is motivated only by spite, revenge, and snobbery. And I think that's about it. I'm possibly warming up to a Matilda podcast, which I wasn't expecting. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and read The Snow Geese.